Sarah Mitchell was tending to her horses in the dusty stable of the Lone Pine Ranch when 3 black SUVs came roaring up her driveway, kicking up clouds of red Arizona dust in their wake. The men who stepped out weren't from around here. They were the Desert Scorpions, a notorious gang of land grabbers who'd been terrorizing small ranches across the Southwest. What they didn't know was that before becoming a rancher's wife, Sarah had been Captain Sarah Swiftshot Mitchell, one of the most decorated female combat veterans in Afghanistan, leading specialized missions that would never make the history books. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered wooden fence posts of Lone Pine Ranch, a modest spread nestled in the heart of Arizona's high desert country. The late October air was crisp and clean, carrying the sweet scent of sage and desert wildflowers. Sarah Mitchell moved with quiet efficiency through her morning routine, her boots crunching softly on the packed earth as she made her way between the stables. At 52, she carried herself with the kind of grace that came from years of discipline and purpose. Her silver-streaked dark hair was pulled back in a neat braid, and though laugh lines crinkled at the corners of her eyes, there was a sharpness to her gaze that suggested she missed very little. The ranch had been her late husband James's pride and joy. He'd built it from nothing, turning a patch of harsh desert into a thriving horse breeding operation through sheer determination and hard work. When cancer took him 2 years ago, Sarah had thrown herself into maintaining his legacy, though the locals whispered it was just a matter of time before she'd have to sell. They didn't know about her other legacy, the one that involved leading elite units through mountain passes in Afghanistan, the one that had earned her the nickname Swiftshot among her fellow soldiers. Most days, Sarah was content to let them think what they wanted. She'd made peace with being underestimated long ago. The ranch hands who worked for her saw a widow trying her best to hold on to her husband's dream. The local ranchers saw a woman in over her head. Even her closest neighbor, Tom Henderson, who'd been friends with James for 30 years, treated her with a kind of gentle condescension, as if she were a child playing at running a ranch. The sound of vehicles approaching pulled Sarah from her thoughts. She was in the stable, checking on Mare's Lady, their prize quarter horse who was due to foal any day now. The rumble of engines was too aggressive for casual visitors, too purposeful to be lost to tourists. Her hand instinctively moved to her hip, where she'd once carried a different kind of tool than the ranch knife that now hung there. 3 black SUVs came barreling down her driveway, expensive vehicles with city plates, kicking up clouds of dust that made the horses nervous. Sarah kept her movements calm and steady as she finished checking on Mare's Lady, her mind already cataloging everything she knew about the Desert Scorpions. They'd been in the local news lately, a gang of sophisticated thugs who used legal pressure and intimidation to force small ranchers to sell their land cheap. There were rumors of violence, of mysterious accidents that befell those who refused to cooperate, but nothing could ever be proven. 6 men climbed out of the vehicles, dressed too nicely for ranch work in their pressed jeans and leather jackets. The leader was easy to spot, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and an expensive watch that caught the sunlight. He moved with the confidence of someone used to getting his way, flanked by 2 younger men who carried themselves like hired muscle. The other 3 spread out, studying the ranch with calculating eyes. "Mrs. Mitchell?" The leader's voice carried across the yard, smooth as aged whiskey but with an edge that set Sarah's teeth on edge. "I'm Vincent Maxwell. I believe my office has been trying to reach you about an offer on your property." Sarah stepped out of the stable, keeping her movements unhurried, deliberate. She'd faced down worse threats in worse places, though these men didn't know that. To them, she probably looked like an easy mark, a widow out of her depth, struggling to maintain a ranch that was too much for her to handle. Her boots left clear prints in the dust as she walked toward them, her posture relaxed but alert, just as it had been during countless patrols through hostile territory. "Mr. Maxwell," she acknowledged, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "I received your letters. I thought my lack of response made my position clear." She stopped a careful distance away, close enough to be polite, far enough to maintain tactical advantage. Old habits died hard. Maxwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Mitchell, I don't think you understand the opportunity we're offering here. The drought's only getting worse. Small ranches like yours, they're dying out. We're offering you a chance to walk away with something while you still can." Behind him, One of the younger men shifted his weight, his jacket pulling open just enough to reveal the gun holstered beneath it. It wasn't meant to be subtle, it was a message. Sarah's eyes flickered to it for just a moment, her mind automatically calculating angles, distances, potential cover. The skills she'd honed in combat hadn't faded. They'd just been dormant like a rattlesnake waiting in the shade. Maxwell took a step closer, his Italian leather boots raising little puffs of dust with each deliberate stride. The morning sun caught the diamond ring on his right hand, sending sharp glints of light dancing across the weathered wood of the stable. His men spread out in a practiced formation that might have looked casual to an untrained eye, but Sarah recognized it for what it was, a tactical positioning designed to control the space. "Let me be frank, Mrs. Mitchell," Maxwell said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "The water rights alone are worth more than this entire spread. The drought's hitting everyone hard and smart folks are getting out while they can still turn a profit." He gestured expansively at the ranch, his contempt barely concealed. "Your husband, God rest his soul, he was a good man. But he was running this place on borrowed time. And we both know it." The mention of James made Sarah's jaw tighten, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd learned long ago in Afghanistan that showing emotion could get you killed. The youngest of Maxwell's men, a wiry guy with tattoos creeping up his neck, snickered at his boss's words. He was fidgety, aggressive, the kind of person Sarah had learned to watch in combat situations. A loose cannon. "Rick," Maxwell barked at the tattooed man, "why don't you and Jake take a look around? Get a sense of the property value." The implied threat wasn't subtle. Behind her, Sarah could hear her horses growing restless in their stalls, sensing the tension in the air. The two men started moving, but Sarah's voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. "This is private property. You haven't been invited to look around." Her words were calm, but carried the unmistakable weight of authority, the same tone she'd used commanding troops in the field. Maxwell's eyebrows rose slightly, an amused smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Mrs. Mitchell, I don't think you understand your situation here. We're trying to help you. Times are changing, and holding on to the past." He shook his head in mock sympathy. "It can be dangerous." "Like what happened to the Carson place?" Sarah asked quietly, her eyes steady on Maxwell's face. 2 months ago, the Carson ranch had mysteriously burned down after refusing a similar offer. The old couple who owned it had barely made it out alive. The investigation was still ongoing, but everyone knew the truth. A flash of something, surprise, respect, crossed Maxwell's face before his smooth mask slipped back into place. "Accidents happen," he said softly. "Especially out here in the middle of nowhere. It would be a shame if something happened to your beautiful horses, or to you." The tattooed man, Rick, laughed openly now, a harsh sound that echoed off the stable walls. "Yeah, lots of accidents waiting to happen on a ranch. Ain't that right, boys?" The other men chuckled, spreading out further, their body language becoming more aggressive. Sarah remained still, her mind racing through scenarios just as she had in combat situations. She noted the positions of each man, the weapons they weren't quite concealing, the distances to various points of cover. The skills that had kept her alive through 3 tours in Afghanistan hadn't faded. They'd just been sleeping. "I appreciate your concern," she said evenly, "but this ranch isn't for sale. Not now, not ever." She took a step forward, closing the distance between herself and Maxwell slightly. It was a calculated move, one that made his men tense up, uncertain. Most people being threatened backed away. She was moving closer. Maxwell's smile faltered for just a moment. He wasn't used to this kind of resistance, especially not from someone he'd dismissed as an easy target. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr, "you seem like a reasonable woman. Let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. We're offering you a fair price. More than fair, considering the circumstances." "The circumstances," Sarah repeated, her voice flat. She could see Rick and another thug moving toward the stable where Mayor's lady was housed. The pregnant horse nickered nervously, picking up on the tension. And what circumstances would those be, Mr. Maxwell? Times are tough. Maxwell spread his hands in a gesture of false sympathy. A woman alone, trying to run a ranch this size. Accidents happen. Equipment breaks down. Fires start. Animals get spooked. He paused, letting the implications sink in. It would be a shame if something happened to those prize horses of yours. I hear Mayor's Lady is due to foal soon. The threat to her horses made something cold and familiar settle into Sarah's chest, the same feeling she'd had before combat operations. Her fingers itched for the reassuring weight of a weapon, but she kept her hands loose at her sides. She didn't need a weapon to be dangerous. Her training had taught her that much. "Mr. Maxwell," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard, "I'm going to say this once, and I want to make sure you understand me perfectly. This ranch is not for sale, not to you, not to anyone. Now I suggest you and your men leave my property before this becomes something you'll regret." Maxwell's laugh was sharp and sudden, like a gunshot in the morning air. His men joined in, their amusement echoing off the stable walls, spooking the horses inside. Only Rick, the tattooed loose cannon, didn't laugh. He was too busy eyeing the pregnant mare through the stable door, a mean glint in his eyes that made Sarah's combat instincts scream warnings. "Something we'll regret?" Maxwell repeated, taking another step closer. He was trying to use his height to intimidate her, a tactic Sarah had seen countless times before, from Taliban commanders to local warlords. "Mrs. Mitchell, I don't think you understand what regret really means. Not yet." Sarah's mind flashed back to a moonless night in the Hindu Kush, where she'd led her unit through a narrow mountain pass while enemy fighters watched from above. She'd learned then what real regret meant, the kind that came with lost soldiers and failed missions. These men, with their expensive SUVs and designer boots, they were playing at being dangerous. They'd never faced real threats, never made decisions that meant life or death. "Tell me something," Maxwell continued, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that was somehow more menacing than his previous threats. "How much do you know about ranch accidents? They're fascinating, really. Horses get spooked easily. Stables catch fire. Sometimes people fall, break things. Out here, so far from help." He spread his hands in a gesture of false concern. "Well, response times aren't what they should be." Rick moved closer to Mayor's Lady's stall, pulling out a switchblade and flicking it open. The sound made the pregnant horse stamp nervously. "Boss, this mare looks awful skittish," he called out, grinning. "Might hurt herself if we're not careful." Sarah's hands clenched at her sides, but she kept her voice steady. "Step away from my horse." The command in her tone was unmistakable. It was the same voice that had ordered troops into position, that had directed strategic operations across hostile territory. Maxwell's eyebrows rose slightly at her tone, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before his smooth mask slipped back into place. "Mrs. Mitchell, you seem like a woman who appreciates directness, so let me be clear. You have two choices here. You can sign the papers we brought, take our very generous offer, and walk away from this place with your health and dignity intact. Orient." He gestured to his men, who were now spreading out in a loose semicircle around her. "We can do this the hard way." Sarah saw Rick press the blade against the wooden door of Mayor's Lady's stall, starting to carve something into it. The pregnant horse whinnied in distress, and something in Sarah shifted. The careful restraint she'd maintained began to crack, revealing glimpses of the soldier beneath. "Your man has exactly 5 seconds to step away from my horse," she said, her voice carrying the deadly calm of a combat veteran who'd faced far worse threats than these thugs. "After that, I stopped being polite." Maxwell's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Or what, Mrs. Mitchell? What exactly do you think you're going to do?" He looked around at his men, encouraging their laughter. "There are 6 of us, and you're just a widow trying to hold on to her dead husband's dream. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Sarah's eyes tracked each man's position automatically, just as she'd been trained. 2 by the SUVs, hands near their concealed weapons. Rick by the stable, still threatening Mayor's Lady. Maxwell and 2 others forming a loose triangle around her. She noted distances, angles, potential weapons within reach. The old combat algorithms ran through her mind, muscle memory from years of specialized training rising to the surface. Last warning, she said quietly, shifting her weight slightly. "Get off my property." Maxwell sighed theatrically. "Boys, I think Mrs. Mitchell needs a demonstration of what we're talking about." He nodded to Rick. "Why don't you show her what happens to stubborn people's property?" Rick's grin turned ugly as he raised the switchblade, clearly intending to slash at Mayor's lady through the stable door. But before he could complete the motion, Sarah moved. It wasn't the hesitant movement of a frightened widow. It was the explosive acceleration of a combat veteran. 3 quick strides brought her to Rick before anyone could react. Her hand locked around his wrist with practiced precision, applying pressure to exactly the right nerve cluster. The switchblade clattered to the ground as Rick's hand spasmed open involuntarily. In the same fluid motion, she twisted his arm behind his back, using his own momentum to slam him face first into the stable wall. The whole sequence took less than 2 seconds. One moment Sarah had been standing in front of Maxwell. The next, Rick was pinned and disarmed, his face pressed against the weathered wood as he cursed in pain and surprise. The other men froze, their confidence suddenly shaken by this unexpected display of skill. Maxwell's smooth facade cracked for the first time, showing genuine surprise. "What the hell?" he muttered, taking an involuntary step back. His hand moved toward his jacket, but Sarah's voice stopped him. "I wouldn't," Sarah said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that could only come from years of commanding troops in combat situations. "Your men are carrying Glock 19s, poorly concealed under those expensive jackets. Drawing them would be a federal offense considering none of you have concealed carry permits." She applied slightly more pressure to Rick's arm, making him grunt in pain. "And trust me, that's the least of your worries right now." The morning sun caught the silver in Sarah's hair as she held Rick immobile, her movements betraying years of close-quarters combat training. To the casual observer, she appeared to be barely exerting herself, but Maxwell's trained eye could see the lethal efficiency in her stance. This wasn't some self-defense class move. This was professional military training. "Who the hell are you?" Maxwell demanded, his usual smooth confidence cracking further. His men exchanged uncertain glances, their hands hovering near their weapons but not quite daring to draw them. The easy job they'd expected had suddenly become something entirely different. Sarah's laugh was short and sharp. "You should have done your homework, Mr. Maxwell, before you decided to threaten my horses, before you came onto my property making threats." She shifted her grip slightly, causing Rick to whimper. "Captain Sarah Mitchell, U.S. Army Special Operations. Retired, but as your friend here is learning, some skills never fade." Maxwell's face went through a rapid series of emotions, disbelief, anger, and finally, a hint of fear. "You're lying," he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "We checked your background. You're just James Mitchell's widow, a ranch owner's wife." "That's the thing about special operations," Sarah said calmly, her eyes scanning the other men's positions even as she kept Rick pinned. "A lot of it never makes the official records. The missions in Afghanistan, the operations that never happened officially, they don't show up in background checks." She paused, letting that sink in. "You want to know how I met James? He was a civilian contractor, helping train local forces in Kandahar. I was leading the security detail. One of Maxwell's men, the one nearest to the SUVs, took a step back. He'd served in the military himself, and something in Sarah's bearing, in the professional way she held Rick immobile, told him she was telling the truth. "Boss," he said quietly, "maybe we should—" "Shut up," Maxwell snapped, but his voice had lost its smooth confidence. He was used to dealing with desperate ranchers, with people who could be intimidated or bought off. This was something else entirely. "You expect us to believe you were some kind of special forces operator?" "Swift shot," Sarah said quietly, and saw recognition flash across the face of the man who'd started to back away. "That's what they called me in theater. You can ask your man there, looks like he served. The name was classified, but stories get around." The man by the SUVs paled visibly. "Boss, I've heard that name. She's not lying. Swift shot Mitchell. There were stories about a female operator who—" He trailed off, swallowing hard. Sarah kept her voice steady as she addressed Maxwell directly. "Your men are nervous. They should be. Right now I've got one of them immobilized with a joint lock that can turn into a brake, with just a little more pressure. I've got clear lines of sight on all of you, and unlike your men, I actually know how to use a weapon effectively." As if to emphasize her point, she shifted her grip on Rick slightly, causing him to yelp. The sound echoed off the stable walls, making the horses stamp nervously in their stalls. Maxwell's remaining men exchanged increasingly uncertain looks. This wasn't how their usual intimidation tactics were supposed to go. "You see," Sarah continued, her voice taking on a teaching tone that she'd used briefing troops, "the problem with thugs like you is that you're used to preying on the helpless. You look at a widow running a ranch alone and you see an easy target. You never stop to consider that I might be capable of defending myself." Her eyes locked onto Maxwell's. "You never asked why a civilian contractor like James would marry a ranch owner's daughter and settle down here. Never wondered about the security systems I installed or why local law enforcement responds so quickly to calls from this property." Maxwell's hand twitched toward his jacket again, but Sarah's warning came swift and sharp. "You don't want to do that. Your men are in the wrong positions for a firefight. You've got no cover, and you're dealing with someone who spent years in actual combat situations. How do you think that's going to play out?" The tension in the morning air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The only sounds were the nervous shuffling of horses in their stalls and Rick's pained breathing. Maxwell's carefully constructed plan was unraveling, and for perhaps the first time in his life, he found himself facing someone he couldn't intimidate or outmaneuver. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the tense standoff. 2 dust-covered pickup trucks came roaring up the driveway, their engines growling with purpose. Sarah's lips curved into a slight smile, though her grip on Rick never wavered. The cavalry, right on time. "You're probably wondering about those trucks," she said conversationally to Maxwell, whose face had gone a shade paler. "Remember when I mentioned James was a civilian contractor? Well, he made some interesting friends during his time overseas, the kind of friends who don't take kindly to people threatening their own." The trucks skidded to a halt in a cloud of dust, and 4 men jumped out. They moved with the unmistakable precision of military training, spreading out in a practiced formation. The leader, a weathered-looking man in his 50s wearing a dusty cowboy hat, stepped forward. His stance was casual, but his eyes scanned the scene with professional assessment. "Everything all right, Sarah?" he called out, his hand resting casually near his hip where a holstered pistol was clearly visible. Unlike Maxwell's men, he had the permits and training to carry it. "Just fine, Mike," Sarah replied, not taking her eyes off Maxwell. "Mr. Maxwell and his friends were just leaving. Weren't you, Vincent?" Mike Thompson, former Delta Force operator and now owner of the neighboring Triple T Ranch, nodded slowly. "Maxwell, huh? Heard about your little operation. Been buying up ranches all across the county. Or should I say, intimidating people into selling." His voice hardened. "We don't take kindly to those tactics around here." Maxwell's remaining bravado crumbled as he realized just how badly he'd miscalculated. His eyes darted between Sarah, still holding Rick in an expert joint lock, and the new arrivals who were clearly more than just regular ranch hands. "This is a business matter," he tried, but his voice lacked conviction. "We're just trying to negotiate a fair deal." "Fair deal?" Mike's laugh was harsh. "Like the deal you gave the Carsons, before their place mysteriously burned down?" He took a step closer and Maxwell instinctively backed up. "See, that's the thing about small communities like ours. We look out for our own. And Sarah here? She's not just any rancher's widow. She's family." One of Mike's men, a massive Native American who moved with the grace of a trained fighter, spoke up. "Boss, I recognized 2 of these guys from the Carson fire investigation. Never could prove anything, but..." He let the implication hang in the air. Sarah could feel Rick trembling slightly in her grip now. The tough guy act had evaporated, replaced by the genuine fear of someone who suddenly realized they were way out of their depth. Maxwell's other men were starting to edge back toward their SUVs, their earlier confidence completely shattered. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah said, her voice carrying the same command presence that had once directed covert operations. I'm going to let Rick here go. You're all going to get in your fancy SUVs and leave, and you're going to forget about Lone Pine Ranch. In fact, you're going to forget about this whole county." Mike stepped forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "And if we hear about any more mysterious accidents, any more ranchers being pressured to sell, well, let's just say we've got friends in some interesting places. People who know how to investigate things properly. People who might be very interested in your organization's activities." Maxwell's face had gone from pale to ashen. The smooth-talking businessman was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood just how badly he'd misread the situation. "This isn't over," he tried to threaten, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Actually, it is," Sarah said firmly. She released Rick with a slight push, sending him stumbling toward his boss. "But if you don't believe me, try coming back. See what happens when you mess with a combat veteran and her special operations friends." Rick scrambled to his feet, rubbing his wrist and trying to recover some dignity. But his eyes were wide with fear as he looked at Sarah, finally seeing her for what she was. Not a helpless widow, but a trained warrior who could have done much worse than simply restraining him. "Your knife," Sarah said, nodding to where the switchblade lay in the dust. "Leave it. Consider it a reminder of why you shouldn't threaten people's horses." Maxwell gathered what was left of his dignity, straightening his expensive jacket. "You're making a mistake," he said, but the threat in his voice had been replaced by uncertainty. "You can't protect every ranch in the county." Mike stepped forward, and this time Maxwell actually flinched. "Watch us," the former Delta operator said quietly. "You see, Sarah's not the only veteran around here. This whole area, it's home to quite a few of us who served. People who know how to handle themselves. People who don't take kindly to bullies." The morning sun had risen higher, casting harsh shadows across the ranch yard as Maxwell and his men retreated to their vehicles. Sarah watched them go, her posture still alert, still ready for any last-minute attempts at retaliation. But the fight had gone out of them. The SUVs started up with a roar, turning in tight circles before speeding back down the driveway, leaving clouds of dust in their wake. As the dust settled in the wake of Maxwell's hasty retreat, Sarah finally allowed her shoulders to relax slightly. She turned to Mike and his men, a ghost of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Your timing's still perfect, I see." Mike pushed his cowboy hat back, revealing graying hair and laugh lines that did nothing to diminish his commanding presence. "Well, when Tom at the general store called saying he saw Maxwell's convoy heading this way, I figured it was time for a neighborly visit." His expression grew serious. "They've been causing trouble all across the county. Didn't expect them to run into someone like you, though." The massive Native American John Running Bear bent down to pick up Rick's abandoned switchblade. "Should we turn this in as evidence?" he asked, examining the weapon with professional interest. Like many of Mike's ranch hands, John was more than he appeared, a former Army Ranger who'd served 3 tours in Iraq. Sarah shook her head. "Keep it. Might come in handy if we need to prove they were here making threats." She turned toward the stable where Mayor's lady was still stamping nervously. "First, I need to check on my horse." As she moved toward the stall, Mike fell into step beside her, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "James would be proud, you know. The way you've kept this place running, the way you handled these thugs." He paused, studying her profile. "He always said you were the strongest person he knew." Sarah's throat tightened at the mention of her late husband. "He was the strong one," she said quietly, reaching out to stroke Mayor's lady's nose through the stall door. "Building this place from nothing, making it work despite everyone saying it couldn't be done." "You both were strong," Mike corrected her. "That's why you worked so well together. The decorated combat veteran and the civilian contractor who understood what that meant." He looked around the ranch, taking in the well-maintained buildings and healthy horses. "And you're still keeping his dream alive, just with a different kind of strength." The rest of Mike's men had spread out around the property, taking up casual but strategic positions. To an untrained eye, they might have looked like regular ranch hands, but Sarah recognized the way they moved, the way they maintained clear lines of sight. These were men who, like her, had never really left their combat training behind. "Word's going to spread," John said, walking up to join them, "about what happened here today. Maxwell's type, They rely on people being too scared to fight back, but when people hear about how a widow stood up to them, he grinned, his teeth white against his dark skin. Well, that might change things. Sarah checked Mare's lady thoroughly, making sure the horse hadn't been injured by the confrontation. The mare nuzzled her hand, already calming down now that the threat had passed. That's what I'm worried about, she admitted. Maxwell doesn't strike me as the type to take humiliation well. He might try something else. Mike's expression hardened. Let him try. After what happened to the Carsons, we've got cameras set up all around the perimeter of every ranch in the area. Motion sensors, satellite feeds, probably better security than we had in some forward operating bases. He smiled grimly. Amazing what you can do with military contacts and a shared hatred of bullies. One of Mike's other men, Dave Wilson, came jogging up from the direction of the main house. Like the others, he moved with the unconscious grace of someone who'd spent years in combat situations. Perimeter's clear, he reported. No signs they left anyone behind or planted any surprises. But we'll keep an eye out just in case. Sarah nodded, feeling a familiar warmth in her chest. The same feeling she'd had with her unit in Afghanistan, knowing she could trust the people around her with her life. I appreciate it, she said softly. All of you. I know you've got your own ranches to run. Stop right there, Mike cut her off. You remember what we used to say in the service? Leave no one behind? He gestured around at his men, who were all nodding. That doesn't end just because we're civilians now. This community, it's like our new unit. We look out for each other. John hefted the switchblade, his expression thoughtful. You know, in my tribe, we have a saying. The wolf that hunts alone is dangerous, but the pack that hunts together is unstoppable. Maxwell and his type, they're used to picking off isolated targets. They don't know how to handle people who stick together. Sarah looked around at these men, veterans who'd found a new purpose in ranching, who'd built a community based on the same principles of loyalty and mutual support that had kept them alive in combat. She remembered how alone she'd felt after James died, how the locals had whispered that she'd never be able to keep the ranch going on her own. But she wasn't alone. She had never really been alone. These people, her neighbors, her fellow veterans, they understood her in a way that Maxwell and his thugs never could. They knew what it meant to fight for something bigger than themselves, to protect not just property, but principles. The next few days saw a flurry of activity around Lone Pine Ranch that would have made any military logistics officer proud. Word of Sarah's confrontation with Maxwell's crew spread through the county like wildfire, igniting a spark of resistance that had been dormant for too long. Ranchers who had been considering selling out began to reconsider. Those who had felt isolated and vulnerable suddenly realized they weren't alone. Sarah was in the middle of her morning feed run when she heard the rumble of engines coming up her driveway. This time, instead of sleek black SUVs, she saw a convoy of dusty pickup trucks. The Carsons were in the lead vehicle, the elderly couple who had lost everything in the mysterious fire. Behind them came other ranchers, each bearing supplies and offering support. We should have stood together from the start, old Bill Carson said, his weathered face creased with emotion as he stepped out of his truck. His wife Martha, who hadn't smiled since the fire, was beaming now. When we heard how you stood up to them, Sarah, well, it gave us all courage. Martha reached out and squeezed Sarah's hand. They thought they could pick us off one by one, she said, her voice trembling slightly. A widow here, an elderly couple there. But they didn't count on someone like you showing them what we're really made of. More vehicles arrived throughout the morning. Mike's security teams had thoroughly vetted everyone, maintaining a watchful presence that was both reassuring and professional. Sarah watched as ranchers who had barely spoken to each other in years now worked together, sharing stories and strategies. It's like a barn raising, John Running Bear observed, standing beside Sarah as they watched the community come together. Except what we're building here is stronger than any barn. We're building a defense network. He was right. Ranchers were installing security cameras, sharing radio frequencies, establishing emergency protocols. Veterans like Mike and his men provided training in basic security measures, teaching people how to spot suspicious activity and respond to threats. The skills Sarah had learned in combat were being adapted to protect not just her ranch, but the entire community. "You've started something here," Mike said, joining them with a fresh cup of coffee. "Maxwell and his type, they prey on isolated targets, but now," he gestured at the bustling activity around them, "they're going to find out what it means to face a united front." Sarah watched as Dave Wilson, one of Mike's former military buddies, taught a group of young ranch hands how to operate the new security systems. "It's not just about physical security," she said thoughtfully. "It's about showing them we won't be intimidated anymore." The transformation was remarkable. Ranchers who had once eyed her with pity, wondering how long the widow could hold on to her husband's dream, now looked at her with respect and admiration. They saw not just Sarah Mitchell but Captain Swiftshot Mitchell, a leader who had faced down threats far worse than Maxwell's thugs. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Anderson pulled up in his patrol car. The local law enforcement officer had always been sympathetic, but seemed powerless against Maxwell's legal maneuvering. Now, there was a new determination in his stance. "Got some interesting calls today," he announced to the gathered ranchers. "Seems Mr. Maxwell's organization is suddenly facing investigations from several federal agencies. Anonymous tips about their business practices, especially concerning the Carson fire." He looked meaningfully at Mike and his men. "Wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Mike's innocent expression wouldn't have fooled anyone. "Let's just say some of us still have friends in interesting places. People who take a dim view of thugs threatening American veterans and their communities." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Well, whatever the reason, Maxwell's crew won't be causing trouble around here anymore. They've got bigger problems to worry about now." He turned to Sarah, his expression serious. "You did good, Mrs. Mitchell. Showed everyone that standing up to bullies isn't just about physical strength, it's about having the courage to take that first stand." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ranch, Sarah found herself standing in front of James's old office. Through the window, she could see his military citations on the wall, alongside her own. His for civilian contractor work in conflict zones, hers for combat leadership. They had both served in their own ways, and now she was continuing that service here at home. Martha Carson approached her quietly. "You know, when we lost our ranch, I thought that was it, that everything we'd built was gone forever." She wiped a tear from her eye. "But looking at all this, at everyone coming together, I realized the ranch wasn't just about the land. It was about the community. And thanks to you, that's stronger than ever." Sarah looked out over her property, at the ranchers working together, at the veterans teaching others to protect themselves, at the sense of purpose that had replaced fear and isolation. This wasn't just about protecting individual ranches anymore. It was about preserving a way of life, about showing that sometimes the strongest defense comes not from weapons or tactics, but from people standing together. When Sarah Mitchell faced down Maxwell and his thugs at Lone Pine Ranch that morning, she did more than just protect her property. She ignited a spark that would transform an entire community. 3 months after the confrontation, the changes were evident across the county. The Desert Scorpion's intimidation tactics were replaced by a new spirit of cooperation and resilience among the local ranchers. Mare's Lady had given birth to a healthy foal, and Sarah stood watching them in the morning sun, remembering how close she'd come to losing them both to Maxwell's threats. The sound of approaching vehicles made her smile now instead of tense. It was Thursday, which meant the weekly community meeting at her ranch. "Still hard to believe how much has changed," Mike said, walking up beside her. He'd become a regular fixture at Lone Pine Ranch, helping coordinate the community's security network. "You know the Carson place is almost rebuilt? Everyone pitched in? Materials, labor, everything. Maxwell's insurance company suddenly got very cooperative when those federal investigations started." Sarah nodded, watching as more trucks pulled up. The ranchers who gathered now were different from the fearful, isolated individuals they'd been before. They walked with confidence, greeted each other warmly, shared information and resources freely. The veterans among them had taught the others not just about security, but about the importance of working together. "James would have loved this," she said softly, thinking of her late husband. "He always said ranching wasn't just about the land. It was about the people who worked it, who lived on it, who protected it." The weekly meetings had become more than just security briefings. They were celebrations of community resilience, opportunities for neighbors to support each other. Today, young ranch hands were learning advanced riding techniques from Sarah, while Mike's team conducted security workshops. The Carsons were sharing their expertise in water conservation, crucial knowledge in these drought-stricken times. "You know what the best part is?" John Running Bear said, joining them with a fresh pot of coffee. "Maxwell's crew tried to divide us, make us easy targets. Instead, they made us stronger. United." He grinned. "In my culture, we have a story about a bundle of arrows. One arrow breaks easily, but try breaking them when they're bound together." The story of how a widow's stand against corporate bullies had transformed into a community-wide movement of resistance and mutual support had spread far beyond the county lines. Other rural communities facing similar threats had reached out, seeking advice on organizing their own networks. "It's not just about fighting back," Sarah explained to a reporter who'd come to cover the story. "It's about building something worth protecting. Every rancher here has their own story, their own struggles. But now we face them together." The reporter looked around at the bustling activity. Veterans teaching self-defense classes, ranchers sharing resources and expertise, children playing safely under the watchful eyes of a community that had rediscovered its strength. "And it all started because you refused to be intimidated," she said. Sarah shook her head. "No. It started because we all refused to be intimidated. I just happened to be the first one to show that it was possible." She watched as Martha Carson demonstrated proper foal care to a group of young ranch hands, her confidence restored along with her property. Sometimes people just need to be reminded of their own strength. The transformation wasn't just in the improved security measures or the rebuilt Carson Ranch. It was in the way people carried themselves, the way they looked out for each other. The veterans who had once felt isolated in civilian life had found a new purpose, teaching others the skills they'd learned in service. The ranchers who had once competed now collaborated, sharing resources and knowledge to keep their way of life alive. "You know what Maxwell never understood?" Mike said, watching the community in action. "He thought strength was about intimidation, about having the biggest guns or the most money. But real strength?" He gestured at the gathered ranchers. "Real strength is about standing together, about protecting not just yourself, but your neighbors too." As the sun began to set on another productive day at Lone Pine Ranch, Sarah stood on her porch watching the last of the vehicles pull away. The evening light caught the silver in her hair, reminding her of how much had changed since James's death. She had thought she would spend her widowhood in isolation, just trying to hold on to his dream. Instead, she had helped build something bigger than either of them had imagined. The story of Sarah Mitchell and Lone Pine Ranch became more than just a tale of a widow standing up to corporate bullies. It became a testament to the power of community, to the strength that comes from standing together against intimidation. It showed that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating an enemy, but from building something stronger in the face of adversity. To all those watching this story, remember, true strength isn't about being the toughest or the most intimidating. It's about having the courage to stand up for what's right, and the wisdom to know you don't have to stand alone. Whether you're a veteran, a rancher, or anyone facing seemingly insurmountable odds, remember Sarah Mitchell and the ranchers who transformed threat into opportunity, fear into strength, isolation into community. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed a community coming together to overcome adversity? What does true strength mean to you? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage, resilience, and the power of standing together against intimidation. Remember, the strongest wolves aren't the ones who hunt alone. They're the ones who run with the pack. 1 week after the confrontation at Lone Pine Ranch, Sarah was awakened by an urgent call from Mike. Maxwell's organization had made its move, not with violence, but through paperwork. They'd filed a lawsuit claiming Sarah and her fellow ranchers were operating an illegal militia, citing the security measures and veteran presence as evidence of paramilitary activity. "They're trying to paint us as extremists," Mike explained. his voice tight with controlled anger. "Their lawyers are claiming we're using military tactics to intimidate legitimate business operations. They've even got photos of our security training sessions." Sarah sat at her kitchen table, watching the sunrise paint the desert landscape in shades of gold and purple. The lawsuit didn't surprise her. It was exactly the kind of sophisticated attack she'd expected from someone like Maxwell. He was trying to turn their strength against them, using their military backgrounds to create fear and suspicion. "Get everyone together," she said, her mind already formulating strategies just as it had during mission planning in Afghanistan. "We need to show people who we really are before Maxwell controls the narrative." Within hours, the community center was packed with ranchers, veterans, and local residents. Sarah stood before them, no longer trying to blend in or hide who she was. She wore her old combat boots polished to a shine, and the quiet authority in her voice commanded attention. "Maxwell thinks he can use our service against us," she began, looking out at the faces of people who had become more than just neighbors. "He thinks he can twist our commitment to protecting each other into something sinister. But we know the truth. Everything we learned in the military about leadership, about protecting others, about standing together, those aren't things to fear. They're exactly what this community needs." John Running Bear stood up, his massive frame drawing all eyes. "In my unit, we had a saying, 'The best defense is a community that stands together.' Maxwell's trying to divide us with fear. We can't let him succeed." The meeting evolved into a strategy session that would have made any military commander proud. But instead of planning combat operations, they were organizing community outreach programs. Veterans who had been teaching security tactics now volunteered to help at the local school, showing a different side of their training. Sarah found herself leading a new kind of mission. She organized an open house at Lone Pine Ranch, inviting local media to see what Maxwell had tried to portray as a paramilitary compound. They found instead a working ranch where veterans helped young people learn riding, where security cameras protected horses worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, where former soldiers used their skills to support and protect their community. "Look at this," Martha Carson said to a reporter, gesturing at a group of veterans teaching ranch hands about emergency medical care. "These men and women served our country overseas, and now they're serving it again right here. How is that something to fear?" The local sheriff, who had initially been cautious about the security network, spoke up publicly in their defense. "What Maxwell's organization calls paramilitary activity, I call community policing at its finest," he told the county commissioners. "Since these veterans started their security program, we've seen a dramatic decrease in theft, vandalism, and other criminal activity across the county." Sarah watched it all unfold with a mixture of pride and determination. Maxwell had tried to use her military background to isolate her, but instead it had become a rallying point for the community. Each veteran who shared their story, each rancher who spoke about how the security network had protected their property, helped paint a true picture of what they were building. The lawsuit itself began to backfire as more details emerged. Maxwell's organization had a history of using legal intimidation to force sales, but they'd never faced opponents who were so well organized and transparent about their activities. Every security measure was properly documented, every training session was open to public observation, and every veteran involved had an impeccable service record. "You know what really gets me?" Mike said one evening as they watched the sun set over the ranch. "Maxwell thought he could use our service against us because he doesn't understand what it really means. He sees the training, the tactics, the discipline, but he misses the heart of it, the part about protecting people, about building something worth defending." The legal battle with Maxwell's organization took an unexpected turn when Sarah received a call from an old comrade she hadn't heard from in years. Colonel James Blackwood, now working with the Justice Department, had seen the news about the lawsuit and recognized her name. "Swift shot." His familiar voice brought back memories of countless missions. "Heard you're stirring up trouble in civilian life too. Tell me what's really going on out there." Sarah sat in James's old office, surrounded by their combined military honors, and laid out the whole story. The colonel listened intently, occasionally asking sharp questions that cut straight to the heart of the matter. When she finished, there was a long pause on the line, You know, he said finally, there's something interesting about Maxwell's organization. We've been tracking similar operations across several states. They seem to target areas with strategic value, not just for ranching, but for other purposes. Your county, for instance, sits on one of the largest underground aquifers in the region. Sarah's mind raced with the implications. The water rights, she said slowly. Maxwell wasn't just trying to buy up ranches, he was trying to control the water supply. Exactly, Blackwood confirmed. We've found evidence of connections between his organization and certain foreign investment groups that would love to control American water resources. He paused meaningfully. I think it's time we brought some of our own resources into this fight. The next morning, Sarah called an emergency meeting at the community center. As she looked out at the gathered faces, veterans, ranchers, local officials, she felt the same tension she'd experienced before critical missions. Everything was about to change. What we're dealing with isn't just about land grabs or intimidation, she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. It's about something bigger. Maxwell's organization is part of a larger effort to control vital resources, specifically our water rights. The revelation sent a shockwave through the room. Water was life in ranch country, especially during the ongoing drought. The idea that foreign interests might be trying to gain control of their water resources struck at the heart of every person present. Mike stood up, his expression grim. That explains why they've been so persistent, why they're willing to spend so much on legal fees to break us. This isn't just about a few ranches, it's about controlling the entire region. Sheriff Anderson, who had been quietly supportive until now, stepped forward. I've got some news of my own, he announced. Just got word that federal investigators are looking into Maxwell's operation. Seems they're interested in possible violations of national security regulations regarding foreign control of strategic resources. Sarah watched as the implications sank in. What had started as a local struggle between ranchers and developers had evolved into something much larger. But instead of intimidating people, the revelation strengthened their resolve. John Running Bear spoke up, his deep voice resonating with conviction. My people have always known that water is sacred, that controlling it means controlling life itself. Maxwell didn't just underestimate our strength, he underestimated our understanding of what's really at stake. The meeting turned into a strategy session that went well into the night. Veterans applied their military planning skills to mapping out water resources and identifying vulnerable points that needed protection. Ranchers shared generations of knowledge about water management and conservation. Local officials provided data about water rights and usage patterns. This is bigger than just defending our ranches now, Martha Carson declared, her voice strong with purpose. We're defending our way of life, our resources, our children's future. As the meeting wound down, Sarah found herself standing with Mike and John, watching the sunset paint the desert sky in brilliant colors. The landscape that had seemed so harsh when she first arrived with James now felt like the most precious thing in the world. You know what Maxwell never understood? Mike said thoughtfully. He saw the land as something to exploit, the water as something to control. But out here we know better. Everything's connected. The land, the water, the people who work it. John nodded solemnly. In my tribe's traditions, we say that the land doesn't belong to us. We belong to the land. We're its guardians, not its owners. Sarah thought about her years in the military, about all the places she'd fought to protect. Now the battlefield was her own backyard, and the stakes were just as high. But this time she wasn't fighting with weapons. She was fighting with community, with unity, with the strength that comes from people standing together for something they believe in. The next morning, Sarah received another call from Colonel Blackwood. Just wanted you to know, he said, that the federal investigation into Maxwell's organization is going public tomorrow. Things are about to get very interesting in your neck of the woods. Sarah stepped out onto her porch, watching the sun rise over the desert landscape she'd sworn to protect. The battle was far from over, but now they knew exactly what they were fighting for, and exactly how much strength they had when they stood together. The morning after Colonel Blackwood's call, Sarah woke to find her ranch surrounded by news vans. The federal investigation had made national headlines. Foreign interests attempt to control American water resources through real estate scheme. Maxwell's organization was at the center of it all, but now Lone Pine Ranch and its community of veterans had become symbols of resistance. Sarah stood at her kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching reporters setting up their equipment. The sound of helicopter blades thudding overhead told her that even the major networks had arrived. Her phone buzzed continuously with messages from other veteran communities across the country, all asking the same question. How had they done it? How had they stood up to such a powerful organization and won? "You're not going to believe this," Mike said, striding through her front door without knocking. They'd long since dispensed with such formalities. He was holding a tablet, his face tight with concern. "Maxwell's people are trying to spin this. They're claiming we're the security threat, that we're using military tactics to interfere with legitimate foreign investment." Sarah set down her coffee cup, feeling the familiar calm of combat readiness settling over her. "They're desperate," she said. "When people get desperate, they make mistakes." As if to prove her point, a black SUV came roaring up her driveway, scattering the reporters. Rick, the tattooed thug she'd disarmed during their first encounter, jumped out. But this time, instead of trying to intimidate, he looked haunted. "Captain Mitchell," he called out, hands raised to show he was unarmed. "I need to talk to you. It's important. It's about what Maxwell's really planning." Sarah exchanged glances with Mike, who had already positioned himself for a clear line of sight on the unexpected visitor. She stepped out onto her porch, maintaining tactical advantage while staying within range of the security cameras. "Talk," she said simply. Rick's story came tumbling out in a rush. He'd overheard Maxwell on the phone with his foreign backers. The water rights were just the beginning. They had plans to dam up major water sources, create artificial scarcity, force entire regions into dependency. The thuggish intimidation tactics had been a cover for something far more sinister. "I may be a criminal," Rick said, his voice shaking, "but I'm still an American. What they're planning, it's wrong. And after seeing how you all stood together, how you fought back." He pulled out a USB drive. "Everything's on here. Records, recordings, plans, everything." The news crews had gathered around, cameras rolling, capturing every word. Sarah maintained her composure, but her mind was racing with the implications. This wasn't just about protecting their ranches anymore. It was about protecting vital national resources. John Running Bear appeared at her side, silent as a shadow despite his size. "The elders always said the water wars would come," he murmured. "They just didn't expect them to start like this." Sarah took the USB drive, handling it like the precious intelligence it was. "Mike, get Colonel Blackwood on the line. John, start calling the other rancher associations. If Maxwell's people are planning what Rick says they are, other communities need to be warned." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Federal agents arrived to debrief Rick and secure the evidence. News helicopters circled overhead as reporters broadcasted live updates. But what really caught Sarah's attention were the trucks starting to arrive. Ranchers and veterans from neighboring counties, even neighboring states, all coming to offer support. "It's happening everywhere," one rancher from Texas told her, his face grim. "Different companies, different tactics, but the same goal, trying to control the water. But you folks showed us how to fight back." Martha Carson had set up a command center in the community hall, coordinating information from other ranching communities facing similar threats. The skills they'd developed protecting their own county were now being shared across state lines, creating a network of resistance against corporate water grabs. "You know what's really interesting?" Mike said, reviewing the data from Rick's USB drive. "These foreign investors, they're the same ones who've been buying up water rights in other countries. They create artificial scarcity, then sell access back to the local communities at inflated prices. They thought they could do the same thing here." Sarah stood in her husband James's office, looking at their combined military decorations. She remembered him telling her once that the next great conflicts wouldn't be fought over oil or land, but over water. She hadn't fully understood then, but now. "They thought we were just a bunch of scattered ranchers," she said quietly. "Easy targets. They never understood what it means to face people who've spent their lives fighting for something bigger than themselves. A commotion outside drew her attention. More vehicles were arriving, but these weren't news vans or federal agents. They were ranchers, veterans, community members from across the region. Each one had a story about facing similar pressure, similar threats, and each one had come to stand with the community that had shown them how to fight back. The contents of Rick's USB drive proved more explosive than anyone had anticipated. As Sarah and Mike pored over the files in James's old office, their military training kicked in, recognizing patterns that civilians might have missed. Maxwell's organization wasn't just buying up ranches. They were systematically targeting properties along major aquifer routes, creating a network that could effectively control water distribution across multiple states. "Look at this," Mike said, pointing to a map on his laptop screen. "They've already acquired properties in 3 neighboring states, each one sitting on crucial water access points. It's like they're creating a choke point system." Sarah leaned closer, her eyes narrowing as she recognized the tactical significance. "They're using military strategy," she said quietly. "These positions, they're not random. Someone with strategic training planned this." Before they could discuss further, John Running Bear burst into the office. "We've got trouble," he announced, his usually calm voice tight with urgency. "Maxwell's people just showed up at the Carsons' rebuilt ranch, but this time they're not playing nice. They've got private security contractors, professionals." Sarah was on her feet instantly, muscle memory from countless combat situations taking over. How many? 2 teams looking like ex-military themselves. They're claiming the Carsons' new building permits weren't properly filed, trying to shut down the reconstruction. Through the window, Sarah could see more trucks arriving at her ranch, veterans and ranchers responding to the news of Maxwell's latest move. But these weren't just local folks anymore. License plates from Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado showed how far the network of resistance had spread. "They're getting desperate," Mike observed, checking his phone as messages poured in from other communities. "Using contractors means they're losing faith in their legal strategy. Rick's evidence must have them running scared." Sarah moved to her gun safe, entering the combination with practiced efficiency. Inside, next to her old service pistol, sat a folder she hadn't opened in years. "There's something else you need to see," she said, pulling out the folder. "Something James left me before he died." The documents inside detailed James's own investigation into water rights conspiracies during his time as a civilian contractor. He'd been tracking similar patterns in other countries, foreign interests using private security firms to gain control of water resources. The final page was a letter to Sarah, dated just weeks before his death. "If you're reading this," Sarah read aloud, "it means they've finally made their move. The people I've been tracking, they're patient, well-funded, and they play the long game. But they have one weakness. They don't understand the strength of community. They see division where we see unity." A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see Martha Carson's truck speeding up the driveway, dust billowing behind it. The elderly woman practically fell out of her vehicle, her face flushed with anger and fear. "They're tearing up our new foundation," she cried as Sarah and the others rushed out to meet her. "Those contractors, they brought heavy equipment. They're saying our permits are invalid, that the whole rebuild is illegal." Sarah turned to Mike and John. "Get our people together, all of them. It's time to show Maxwell's contractors what they're really up against." She paused, a dangerous smile playing at her lips. "And call Colonel Blackwood. Tell him to bring those federal agents back. I think it's time we played our trump card." Within an hour, a convoy of vehicles was assembled at Lone Pine Ranch. But these weren't just angry ranchers with pitchforks. These were veterans who had served in every branch of the military, who understood tactics and strategy, who knew how to handle themselves against trained opposition. They had traded their uniforms for ranch clothes, but they hadn't lost their skills or their sense of duty. "Remember," Sarah addressed the gathered crowd, her voice carrying the authority of a combat commander, "these contractors are professionals. They're expecting to intimidate civilians. What they're not expecting is a coordinated response from people who know their playbook. We do this smart, We do this legal, and we do this together. As the convoy prepared to move out, Sarah noticed Rick standing uncertainly near the back of the crowd. The former thug seemed transformed, watching the veterans and ranchers working together with a mix of awe and regret. "You can still make this right," Sarah told him, her voice firm but not unkind. "Your testimony about Maxwell's operation, combined with the evidence you brought us, it could make the difference." Rick nodded slowly, straightening his shoulders. "I've been on the wrong side of too many fights," he said. "Maybe it's time I fought for something worth believing in." The convoy of vehicles approached the Carson property just as the sun reached its peak in the desert sky. From her position in the lead truck, Sarah could see the private contractor's heavy equipment positioned around the Carsons' partially rebuilt ranch house. 4 black SUVs were parked in a defensive formation, and men in tactical gear stood guard, their stance and positioning betraying their military background. "Ex-Blackwater, if I had to guess," Mike muttered from the passenger seat, his experienced eyes scanning the scene. "See how they've set up their perimeter? That's private military contractor training." Sarah nodded, noting the familiar tactical positioning. "They're good," she acknowledged. "But they're fighting for a paycheck. We're fighting for our homes." The contractors noticed their approach, quickly moving to defensive positions. Their leader, a tall man with a closely cropped gray beard, stepped forward as Sarah's convoy came to a stop. His hand rested casually near his hip, where an expensive holster was visible under his tactical vest. "This is private property under legal dispute," he called out, his voice carrying the clipped tones of someone used to giving orders. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises." Sarah stepped out of her truck, and behind her, dozens of car doors opened as veterans and ranchers emerged. The contractor's eyes widened slightly as they recognized the military bearing of many in the group. This wasn't the civilian resistance they'd expected. "Actually," Sarah replied, her voice carrying across the yard, "this property belongs to Bill and Martha Carson. Your client's lawsuit is based on fraudulent claims, as the federal investigation is currently proving." She held up a folder. "We have the evidence right here, including sworn testimony about your employer's illegal activities." The contractor leader's expression remained neutral, but Sarah caught the slight tension in his shoulders. "Ma'am, we have our orders and legal documentation. If you interfere with our work, we'll be forced to—" "To what?" John Running Bear stepped forward, his massive frame imposing even without weapons. "To attack American veterans on American soil? To help foreign interests steal our water rights?" His voice carried across the yard. "How much are they paying you to betray your own country?" The words hit home. Several of the contractors shifted uncomfortably, looking to their leader for guidance. They were trained professionals, but this wasn't the job they'd signed up for. "You know what's really interesting?" Sarah continued, taking another step forward. "We found evidence that your employer's been hiring contractors for similar operations in other countries, creating artificial water scarcities, forcing local populations into dependency." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Is that really the side you want to be on?" The sound of approaching helicopters filled the air. 2 black military-style choppers appeared over the horizon, bearing federal agency markings. Colonel Blackwood had come through. "Those aren't just any federal agents," Mike called out to the contractors. "That's a joint task force investigating foreign interference in strategic resources. The kind of investigation that gets senators involved and makes international headlines." The contractor leader's hand dropped from his weapon as he assessed the rapidly changing situation. Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes, weighing his contract against the growing risk. "Your employer didn't tell you everything," Sarah pressed her advantage. "About the federal investigation, about the evidence we have, about who you're really working for. But we will." She gestured to Rick, who stepped forward with a laptop. "Everything's here. Money trails, foreign connections, previous operations in other countries. The kind of information that makes careers end and investigations begin." The helicopters were landing now, kicking up clouds of desert dust. Federal agents began to emerge, their badges catching the sunlight. The contractor leader made his decision. "Stand down," he ordered his men. We're not getting paid enough for this kind of heat. He turned to Sarah, professional respect evident in his voice. You've obviously got more cards to play than we were told about. This isn't our fight. As the contractors began to withdraw, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Martha Carson, tears of joy streaming down her face. You did it, the older woman whispered. You really did it. But Sarah shook her head, watching as veterans and ranchers moved forward to secure the area, working seamlessly with the arriving federal agents. We did it, she corrected. All of us together. That's what Maxwell and his people never understood. They thought they could divide and conquer, but they just made us stronger. Colonel Blackwood approached, a satisfied smile on his weathered face. Nice work, Captain Mitchell. Your intel was solid. We've got teams moving on Maxwell's other operations as we speak. This wasn't just about saving a few ranches. You helped us expose a major threat to national security. The sun was setting over the Carson property, painting the desert in shades of gold and purple. The heavy equipment that had threatened their rebuild stood idle, and already ranchers were moving in to assess and repair any damage. This battle was won, but Sarah knew the war wasn't over. They'll try again, she said quietly to Mike and John. Maybe not here, maybe not the same way, but somewhere. Let them try, John replied, his voice firm. We'll be ready, and we won't be alone. When 3 black SUVs rolled up to Sarah Mitchell's ranch that fateful morning, Maxwell's thugs thought they were confronting a helpless widow. Instead, they found themselves facing Captain Swift Shot Mitchell, a decorated combat veteran whose stand against intimidation exposed a nationwide conspiracy to control America's water resources. What began as harassment at a small desert ranch evolved into something far more significant. Sarah's military expertise, which Maxwell tried to use against her, became the cornerstone of a movement that united veterans, ranchers, and communities across the Southwest. The foreign interests behind Maxwell's organization hadn't counted on facing opponents who understood both tactical strategy and the power of unity. Today, Lone Pine Ranch stands as more than just a successful horse breeding operation. It's become a symbol of resistance and a training ground where veterans teach other communities how to protect their resources and stand together against corporate intimidation. The security network Sarah and her fellow veterans created has been replicated across the country, ensuring that no community stands alone against such threats. As for Maxwell's operation, the federal investigation sparked by Sarah's stand led to international arrests and the protection of vital water resources across multiple states. But ask Sarah, and she'll tell you the real victory wasn't in defeating Maxwell. It was in showing that true strength comes from standing together, protecting what matters, and never backing down from what's right. Share your thoughts below. Have you witnessed your community uniting against seemingly impossible odds? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage, unity, and justice prevailing against all odds.